When Tears of the Kingdom finally comes out, there's a high chance I won't see the sun for a couple weeks. Not that I'll stop what else I'm doing, discounting any unforeseen circumstances, but I remember how much Breath of the Wild really shocked me in its encompassing hold on my life, and I'm just preparing to have it on my mind for months all over again. Though I've never gotten into it much here, I'm a big Zelda guy. The Wind Waker and Majora's Mask in my top 10 most personally influential titles, but despite having played many of them over and over, I never felt quite as blissfully exhausted as I did by Breath's End. It's one of those games I've played twice and enjoyed more on a second go, partly because it wasn't a carbon copy of my first. It couldn't be. The first time I was really fumbling around and trying to feel it out, confused at how to best achieve my objectives, and maybe on occasion getting frustrated at the idea I was doing it wrong, even if I was otherwise having a total blast and getting in my potassium. It all clicked on the second playthrough though, and despite taking less time to complete, I did and saw more, and felt like my efforts were rewarded with an even more interesting experience. I genuinely think now it's my third favourite of the series. You can tell it's good because Matthew Matosis put on the soft voice for the review, which is always the best indicator that it was doing something right.
It's no wonder why they settled on this title when the entire world seems to breathe the way it does.
And this is a scene that should have been cut and Kojima slapped across the face.
The sequel looks set to offer much of the same, and I'm glad they've been tight-lipped about the full extent of what might be in there. I have taken a peek, of course, that's why you're seeing this footage, but I'm glad that even after doing so, I'm still for the life of me not able to figure out what the bloody hell is going on. There's the odd guy out there calling this poor marketing, but that comes across to me like a hungry baby bird, demanding to be fed and not willing to subsist on the cope. It's very good that they've been so secretive about it, showing a level of confidence in the experience and suggesting there'll be surprises we'll be hit by harder because of that ambiguity, the trailers having been pitch perfect at building to this so far. At least, that's the hopeful take. I'm not going to fool myself into thinking this is a definite home run, or that the surprise is anything more than an interesting new time with some new mechanics and opponents. They were very quick to tell us this was originally planned as an expansion pack, with the same overworld and aspects that made up the original, and that it had to be transferred to a whole new title when they realized it was actually too much to simply release as DLC. That's not in itself a reason to be concerned at all. A lot of us took this to be a similar situation to Majora's Mask, a game that was built on all the assets from Ocarina and made in a much shorter time span. Given how well that turned out, it actually improves the outlook on this one. I figure low expectations are probably for the best anyway. More difficult to be disappointed and easier to have them exceeded. Still, it has taken longer. A whole 6 years have passed since Breath came out. Take a year away if you want for the actual DLC. And if it's not as impactful, it may not feel like much of a sequel. I don't want to assume it's going to be a great deal more outright, but what kind of raised the ante recently was realizing the weight clearly concerns the new gameplay mechanics more than it does the narrative or world, given the sheer amount of variables involved. I remember saying ages ago somewhere that Breath of the Wild was almost the spiritual sequel to Nuts and Bolts, which got me mad ridicule, only to see everyone saying it now. I mean, yes, the comparisons seem more exact because of the new central gimmick, which sees you taking magic tools to build vehicles of any kind out of whatever you can get your hands on. Much more superficially comparable. But the philosophy was there before too. Nuts and Bolts' big draw wasn't just that you could build any vehicle, it's that it would set you a goal and then tell you could solve it pretty much any way you wanted if you had the tools available. Complete the game via your own creativity, which became the way a lot of people approached goals like shrines and everything else in Breath of the Wild.
Oh no! Oh no!
In the end, one got that appeal across to an audience more successfully than the other. Breath of the Wild was that philosophy on a more personal scale, by making the tools extensions of Link rather than some cumbersome vehicle, often tasked with the occasional racing mission. So of course, they felt more immediately rewarding and tied in better with Zelda's overall values. That said, both games offered enough of a controlled experience that regular players could play the games normally, while super genius scientists could discover entirely new formulas that go beyond mortal comprehension. And this feels like an effort to meet both of those expectations directly, offering new tools that capitalize on some of those discoveries and listening to the audience to figure out where to go next. And it's my hope that these new tools, with a sprinkling of new foes and obstacles like the Sky Islands, are enough to keep me hooked alone. It's in keeping with the central effort to try and define what Zelda is and always has been, while offering a fresh experience. Breath of the Wild's re-examination of the series was a pitch that suggested, after a lot of games that built a rich but rigid formula, it might be worth going back to the very first game, figure out the core values it was attempting to convey, and recreate them through tools and ideas developed from that point onwards, from all across the series. Then go a step further and ask what else could be done. People knew that was the case going in, but just playing the game offers that feeling to anyone remotely aware of the original. Very similar to how some of us felt when playing the exploration-heavy Wind Waker for the very first time, compared to Ocarina, which became more apparent when Twilight Princess arrived and doubled down on appeasing those who preferred that title, because trust me, people really wanted this. No beef, of course. Twilight Princess has its moments for me, even if the overworld feels like somebody was walking along the road with a stack of papers and suddenly sneezed. I actually have reason to believe this re-examination was the original plan for Skyward Sword. Haven't seen this brought up much, but when the game was first previewed, a lot of publications talked about Nintendo's desire to change what it meant to explore a Zelda overworld. They wanted to break down the meaning of what was and wasn't a dungeon, and started saying things in those publications like, well, maybe we can put a pathway of puzzles outside, maybe we can change how you use your inventory, maybe the bosses can appear whenever. In fact, the Moldarok boss was originally shown as a demonstration of that, a monster that existed in the overworld, and suddenly he's in the final game in a dungeon as its main boss, despite feeling like a much simpler enemy and even getting a brief reprisal. The game ended up feeling pretty linear and having a lot more issues concerning the control scheme and other aspects, but you can definitely see that attempt to break certain conventions was happening already, and I suspect they were feeling the pinch of the franchise's 25th anniversary as well as the developments being made at the end of the console's lifespan, while still attempting to justify the peripheral, resulting in a game that doesn't quite offer the intentions I think they went in with. Has a lot of Minish Cap DNA too, by the way, which makes so much sense. Beyond the obvious callbacks, it's like a GBA game with a paper bag over its head marked Big Console Boy Now. Anyway, not that everything Breath of the Wild did in breaking away is universally agreed on as a great success. There were of course complaints about the use of divine beasts and shrines, which all felt aesthetically and mechanically the same, replacing long, interconnected, unique dungeons and their titanic bosses with Ganon's tribute band. I sympathize, I was missing out on some of that myself. But I have a feeling as the series goes on, we're not going to mind this step on the road much at all. By Twilight Princess, I was firmly satisfied with the use of the Zelda formula to that point, having been through so many dungeons and bosses which were starting to feel a little tired in Skyward Sword. That I still enjoyed Breath of the Wild as much as I did, while missing a few of those aspects, tells me they were right to at least try. And the hope is that they could start reintroducing those elements on top of this new groundwork, or at least getting the most out of an already very likeable world and cast of characters. I've not seen better.
Fish Pete.
Really, there's a lot to forgive with an experience like this, because I think it feels much more upfront in its intentions, and what really struck me was how even the cutscenes came across as Nintendo having a frank discussion with us about the series, talking about their efforts to explore ways around expectations, to find that balance between keeping us invested and keeping us surprised. The plot, told mostly through flashbacks, concerns a fairly familiar Hyrule ready to face its destiny again. All the relationships are well established, with Link and Zelda involved in this given idea that they will take on the identities offered by the Triforce. You know, the usual Zelda setup. But Zelda herself is trying to figure out if that's really what she wants, attempting to measure up in her own way by re-engineering technologies involving waggle controls. And the king's like, hey, does this really serve our benefit? Why can't you just be Princess Zelda? It was about a system forcing someone to play a role they were fighting against as they figured out what they're supposed to be in life, maybe the same way it was true for the series. And that actually matches the power of a similar commentary in The Wind Waker, concerning the series wanting to move forward. Intended or not, I was glad to see something like that again. And we get the creeping sense that their efforts became corrupted by others who wanted to covet what they had, leading to a war that forces Hyrule to start from scratch and rediscover what they can do to gain the upper hand, as its enemies continue to misuse their discoveries. I loved the new interpretation of Ganon being essentially the bum from Invasion of the Body Snatchers, or what used to be him, anyway. You kicked his pod too early and he wasn't able to finish his perfect form, leaving us with a desperately cobbled together nightmare using whatever he could get his hands on, a much less confident state than the Ganon or Dwarfs from previous titles. I always liked how the variations on Beast Ganon commented on where Ganondorf was in his life, my favourite being Puppet Ganon, symbolic of Ganondorf's age and showing his inability to take on the role of the monster he once was without putting on an elaborate show to compensate, if that's what's going on. Breath of the Wild felt like the first time Ganon was truly off his game, having spent his revival options and showing us a monstrous version of what looks closer to Ganondorf than Ganon, the line between his identities having finally blurred. Works for the Warriors form as well, actually. He's angry. Furious. I want them to put in Ganon. Why will they not use Ganon? The sequel looks set to directly challenge this idea. And while I hope we get lots of Skeledorf, hey, you know what? I got what I thought was cool. If this is the whole show, hey, I'm happy for the rest of you. Either way, there's a lot I'm reading into this that may not be there, but it was a layer of meaning I found for myself that felt more compelling than I expected. And it's why I have a lot of confidence going into Tears of the Kingdom, believing it can be done all over again. It's a real peek in what I thought would be a stronger era for Nintendo at large, originally hoping that Odyssey and Breath would be emblematic of all their franchises going forward, and only really being true for a couple. Between the endless RPGs, it's felt like they've been moving at a snail's pace, and while everyone's very excited about that Metroid Prime remaster, I find it kind of garish personally, it feels like that only exists so we can continue to stall for time on Retro's long-awaited sequel that I really hope matches what was achieved with Zelda. But maybe this is the trade-off. To get a game as masterful as Breath of the Wild or anything close to it with a much more guarded Nintendo, you have to expect this to be what happens. And just grab the really good titles that happen to come along. Maybe Pikmin 4 will be amazing. They have a dog now. Big messy set of thoughts, I know. But I just wanted to get my 2 cents in while I still have them. A slice of my mind before the new game exists. It'll be interesting to see how any of these feelings shake out after I'm done with Tears of the Kingdom. Surreal to think it's been this many years already between the two, but I like to think the wait will be worth it, the way I felt it was with the original. And it's nice to feel this excited about it even now. I guess I'll see you all on the other side. I'll be honest, I don't really have much else to offer here, other than an excuse to actually talk about Zelda. I just felt like I needed to do it, between my other long-form videos about Night Court and the Piglet movie.